The morning of the wedding began with an air of excitement that seemed to fill every corner of the hall. The chandeliers glimmered, the white roses filled the room with their fragrance, and soft music played from the string quartet at the front. Guests chatted quietly, turning their heads whenever a new arrival entered. At the center of it all stood Maria, the bride's mother, her eyes shining with both pride and nerves. She had spent months pouring her energy into every detail of this day, determined to give her daughter the fairy tale moment she deserved. Her dress was elegant but modest, her hair pinned neatly, and though her heart carried years of unspoken hurt, today she wore only joy on her face. Her daughter, Isabella, had been glowing all morning. Maria had zipped her into her lace gown, wiped away her happy tears, and told her how beautiful she looked, just as any mother would. As the bride prepared to walk down the aisle, Maria felt tears sting her eyes, but this time they were tears of pride. For once, she believed the painful chapters of her life were behind her, and all that mattered was Isabella's happiness. The murmurs began slowly at the back of the hall, subtle enough that Maria didn't notice at first. Guests shifted in their seats, whispers rippling forward like a wave. When she finally turned to see what had stolen everyone's attention, her breath caught. Her husband, though estranged from her for years, had arrived. That alone was not shocking. What made the blood drain from her face was the woman on his arm. Young, striking, draped in a scarlet dress that clung to her body. The mistress. Gasps spread like wildfire. Some guests averted their eyes out of politeness, others leaned in closer, eager to see the drama unfold. Maria's hand instinctively gripped the edge of the pew to steady herself. Her heart thudded painfully, her throat tight. She had long suspected the whispers of infidelity, the absences, the excuses about work trips, but to bring her here, to their daughter's wedding, her husband, Richard, wore a smug smile, as though daring anyone to challenge him. He guided the mistress down the aisle with the arrogance of a man convinced the world revolved around him. He caught Maria's gaze and smirked, his eyes full of cruel amusement. Every step he took seemed to mock her presence, to remind her that he had moved on to something younger, fresher. Maria forced her chin higher, refusing to let her composure crack. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her collapse. Still, inside she burned with shame and anger. She glanced toward Isabella, who stood frozen near the entrance, her bouquet trembling in her hands. The bride's radiant smile had faltered, confusion and hurt shadowing her face. Maria's heart ached, not for herself, but for her daughter, whose perfect day was being poisoned by her father's cruelty. As Richard took his seat near the front, he made a show of pulling out a chair for his mistress. The woman giggled softly, settling beside him, her arm draped over his as though marking territory. The whispers in the hall grew louder. Maria could hear them. How disrespectful, at his daughter's wedding, yet no one dared speak up openly. Every eye seemed to flick between Maria and the pair, waiting to see how she would react. Maria smoothed her dress with trembling hands, her breaths shallow but controlled. She told herself again and again, this is Isabella's day. Not his, not hers, Isabella's. But the humiliation clawed at her chest. Memories of their marriage flashed across her mind, the sacrifices she had made, the long nights alone, the quiet strength she had held onto for the sake of her family. And now this was her reward, public betrayal, staged like a spectacle. When Isabella finally walked down the aisle, escorted by her groom, her steps faltered slightly as her eyes flicked toward her father and his companion. But then her gaze found her mother, and Maria smiled through the ache, nodding encouragement. Focus on the joy, my darling, she willed silently. Don't let him take this moment from you. The ceremony began, but the tension lingered like a storm cloud. Richard sat tall, occasionally whispering into the mistress's ear, laughing under his breath as though mocking the sanctity of the event. Maria's cheeks burned, but she did not bow her head. Every time her husband tried to cut her down with his presence, she lifted her chin a little higher. She clasped her hands tightly, praying for strength, not for herself, but for the daughter she loved more than life itself. The guests could feel the undercurrent of hostility, the cruelty of a man intent on humiliating the woman who had once stood beside him. But Maria's dignity became its own quiet defiance. Though her heart was breaking, though tears threatened to spill, she refused to let him see her crumble. If Richard thought he would steal this day from her, he was wrong. This was only the beginning. The ceremony ended with applause, but the air in the hall felt tight, strained, as though everyone had been holding their breath. Guests clapped politely, yet their eyes flickered constantly toward the front rows where Richard sat with his mistress pressed smugly against his side. Maria moved through the motions with grace, smiling for photographs, hugging relatives, adjusting Isabella's veil, but every step felt heavy, her chest tight with humiliation. She could sense the pity in the eyes of her friends, the judgmental whispers that followed her like shadows. At the reception, the tension only grew. The ballroom glittered with fairy lights, the tables adorned with orchids and candles. Laughter rose here and there, but beneath it was the constant hum of speculation. The bride and groom moved gracefully from table to table, thanking guests, but Isabella's smiles never quite reached her eyes. Her fingers clung tightly to her husband's hand, as if anchoring herself against the storm she felt brewing inside. Maria tried to stay out of sight, busying herself with small tasks, making sure the caterers didn't miss any details, fixing a flower arrangement, keeping herself moving so no one would corner her with sympathetic words she didn't want to hear. But when she glanced across the room, she saw Richard lift his glass and lean close to whisper something in the mistress's ear. The young woman threw her head back and laughed loudly, tilting toward him as though she owned the space. Several guests turned their heads at the sound, exchanging glances, and Maria's stomach churned. Isabella saw it too. She froze in the middle of greeting her aunt, her jaw tightening, her eyes darkening. Her aunt noticed and placed a hand gently on her arm, but Isabella shook it off, forcing a brittle smile. Inside, anger was rising, anger she had been holding back since the moment she saw her father arrive with another woman on her arm. This was her wedding day, the day she had dreamed of since childhood. Her mother had worked tirelessly to make it beautiful. And yet, her father had chosen this moment, her moment, to parade his betrayal like a trophy. She wanted to scream, to shout across the room, to demand he leave. But she glanced at her mother, who was arranging silverware on a nearby table with steady, deliberate movements. Maria's face was calm, though her eyes betrayed the battle within. Isabella clenched her fists. Her mother had endured humiliation her whole life for the sake of family, for the sake of appearances. But Isabella was not her mother. She would not let her father's cruelty define this day. Her groom, Daniel, sensed her turmoil. He leaned close, whispering, "Do you want me to say something?" His voice was steady, supportive, but Isabella shook her head. "Not yet," she murmured, though her voice trembled with rage. She wasn't sure what she would do, only that something had to be done. Throughout the meal, Richard made his presence felt. He laughed louder than anyone else, raising his glass ostentatiously, even interrupting conversations at nearby tables with arrogant remarks. Whenever his mistress leaned against him, he smiled in Maria's direction, as if daring her to react. Guests shifted uncomfortably, caught between politeness and disbelief at his shamelessness. Maria, however, never flinched. She sat quietly beside her daughter when invited, applauded the speeches, and smiled through her pain. Each moment, she reminded herself that this was not about Richard, it was about Isabella and Daniel. Still, the sting of betrayal gnawed at her, and every time Richard's laughter rang out, it felt like another wound carved into her heart. Isabella watched all of it, her patience thinning. Her father's behavior was not just an insult to her mother, it was an insult to her, to the family, to the sanctity of the day. Every time her mother swallowed her dignity for the sake of peace, Isabella's fury grew. She whispered to Daniel again, her voice low and sharp, "I can't let him get away with this." Daniel squeezed her hand. "Then don't," he said simply. The evening wore on, but the tension did not ease. When the time came for toasts, Isabella's stomach knotted. She knew her father would seize the moment to humiliate her mother further, to showcase himself as though he were still the head of the family. She could already picture the smug grin, the veiled insults, the mistress smirking at his side. Her chest tightened, anger and dread coiling together like fire ready to burst. She glanced at her mother again, sitting tall despite the whispers, her shoulders squared in quiet strength. Maria had taught her grace, patience, dignity. But tonight, Isabella knew she would teach her father something different. She would show him that cruelty had consequences, that his arrogance, his disregard, would no longer be tolerated. As Richard lifted his glass and prepared to stand, Isabella's eyes narrowed. She squeezed Daniel's hand, her mind made up. The time for silence had ended. This was her day, not his. And she would reclaim it. The clinking of glasses echoed through the ballroom as Richard rose from his chair, his mistress clinging to his arm like an ornament. The chatter of guests faded into an uneasy hush. Everyone knew he was about to speak, and a ripple of anticipation ran through the crowd. Maria's stomach sank, her fingers twisting the napkin in her lap. She had seen that look in Richard's eyes before, the glint of arrogance, the hunger for an audience. This was not a toast of love, it would be a performance, staged for his own pride. He raised his glass high, smiling broadly, his voice booming across the hall. "To my beautiful daughter, Isabella," he began, his tone laced with exaggerated warmth. "And to her fine young husband, Daniel. What a glorious day, a true celebration of love." His words seemed sincere on the surface, but Maria heard the sharpness hidden underneath. Richard never spoke without barbs. The guests raised their glasses, though many did so reluctantly, as though bracing for the sting to come. Richard glanced around, savoring the attention before continuing. "Marriage," he said slowly, pausing for effect, "is a journey. Some unions, as we know, lose their spark. People change, grow apart, and sometimes, a man must find the courage to begin again." A few gasps broke the silence. Maria's cheeks flushed, but she sat frozen, her gaze fixed on the tablecloth. Richard was not even subtle. He was mocking their broken marriage in front of everyone, using their daughter's wedding as his stage. The mistress giggled beside him, sipping her champagne like a queen receiving homage. Richard smirked, enjoying the discomfort he created. "But today, seeing Isabella and Daniel, I am reminded of the power of new beginnings, of choosing happiness no matter what others think." His eyes swept deliberately toward Maria, narrowing with smug satisfaction. "To fresh starts, to love that makes you feel alive again." The mistress pressed her lips against his shoulder, smiling proudly at the scandal he was crafting. Guests exchanged uneasy looks. Some shook their heads, others avoided Maria's eyes altogether, unwilling to confront the cruelty happening in plain sight. Maria felt the tears burning, but she refused to let them fall. She clenched her jaw, determined not to break. But before she could gather herself, Isabella pushed her chair back. The sharp scrape of wood against the polished floor cut through the silence like a blade. All eyes turned as the bride stood tall, her veil trembling with her breath, her bouquet left forgotten on the table. Her voice rang clear, louder than anyone expected. "Enough." The room froze. Richard blinked, caught off guard by the steel in his daughter's tone. Isabella stepped forward, her eyes blazing with fury and hurt. "How dare you?" she said, pointing at him, her voice trembling but powerful. "How dare you come here with her?" She gestured to the mistress, who shrank slightly under the weight of the bride's glare, "and humiliate my mother on my wedding day." Gasps and murmurs erupted across the hall, but Isabella didn't falter. "This day is supposed to be about love, about family. But you couldn't let it be about me, could you, father? You had to make it about you. About your ego, about your games." Richard's smug mask wavered, though he tried to recover with a scoff. "Isabella, darling, you misunderstand." "No," she cut him off, her voice sharp as a whip. "I understand perfectly. You think flaunting your betrayal makes you powerful. But all it makes you is pathetic. My mother gave you everything, her loyalty, her years, her dignity, and you repay her with cruelty. With this circus." Maria's breath caught, her hands trembling as she covered her mouth. She had never seen her daughter so fierce, so unafraid. Isabella's groom stepped forward now, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. Daniel looked directly at Richard, his voice calm but firm. "You should be ashamed. A father should lift his daughter up on her wedding day, not tear her family apart. You don't belong in this moment, not if this is how you choose to behave." Applause began hesitantly, scattered at first, then stronger as more guests joined in. People nodded, clapping, some even standing in support of the bride. The sound filled the room, drowning out Richard's sputtering protests. The mistress shifted uncomfortably, her cheeks flushed crimson. The boldness she had worn earlier seemed to crumble under the weight of so many disapproving eyes. She tugged at Richard's sleeve, whispering urgently, but he sat stiff, his face twisted with anger and embarrassment. Isabella turned back to her mother, her voice softening. "Mom, this day is for you as much as it is for me. Everything I am, everything I have, is because of you. I will not let anyone, especially him, take that away." Maria's eyes brimmed with tears, but now they were tears of pride. She rose from her seat slowly, her hands shaking as she reached for her daughter. The two women embraced tightly, and the guests erupted in louder applause, their cheers echoing through the hall. For once, Richard was no longer the center of attention. The spotlight had shifted, and he sat in the shadows of his own making, powerless as the room celebrated the dignity and love of the very woman he had tried to humiliate. The applause thundered through the ballroom, echoing off the high ceilings and filling every corner with energy. Maria stood at the center of it, her daughter's arms wrapped tightly around her. For a moment, she was overwhelmed, by the sound, by the sight of so many people clapping for her, and by the realization that years of silence, years of swallowing her pain, had finally been answered with respect. Her heart swelled with gratitude and pride, and when she looked at Isabella, she saw not just her daughter but a woman of strength and courage who had stood up against cruelty without hesitation. Richard, however, sat frozen in his chair. His face was red, a mixture of fury and humiliation, his fingers gripping the stem of his glass so tightly it threatened to shatter. The mistress beside him shifted uncomfortably, her earlier smugness long gone. The weight of so many disapproving eyes pressed down on her, and she shrank in her seat, whispering urgently to Richard. But for once, he had no words. His confidence had been stripped bare in front of everyone. Guests began to rise, one by one, moving toward Maria. Old friends, relatives, even acquaintances she barely knew approached her with warm smiles, hugs, and words of admiration. "You raised her well," one elderly aunt said softly, touching Maria's hand. "Your daughter has your strength." Another guest, a family friend, clasped Maria's shoulder firmly. "Don't let him steal another moment from you. This is your day as much as hers." Maria could hardly breathe through the flood of kindness. She had lived for so long in the shadow of Richard's arrogance that she had forgotten what it felt like to be seen, to be honored. For years, he had belittled her, dismissed her sacrifices, made her feel invisible. But now, here she stood, bathed in admiration, her daughter by her side like a shield of light. Isabella turned toward the room, her voice clear and steady. "Tonight, I want to make something very clear," she said, her hand still holding her mother's. "This woman, my mother, has been the backbone of my life. She is the reason I stand here today, strong and ready for this new chapter. Without her, there would be no me, no wedding, no celebration. So if we are raising our glasses tonight, let it be first for her." The crowd erupted again, glasses lifted high. "To Maria," voices called out, echoing across the room. Champagne sparkled in the light as dozens of glasses clinked together. Maria's face flushed with emotion, tears slipping freely down her cheeks now, but they were tears of joy, of release, of triumph. She laughed through them, pressing her hands to her chest as guests toasted her name. Across the room, Richard's jaw clenched tighter. His attempt to humiliate had turned into his own undoing. His mistress, clearly sensing the shift, pulled her arm away from his and muttered something sharp under her breath. He tried to hold her there with a glare, but she shook her head. "I didn't come here for this," she hissed, and with a final glance at the room full of eyes filled with judgment, she rose from her seat and slipped out quietly, leaving Richard alone. The sight was not lost on anyone. Whispers spread quickly. The mistress leaving, the husband abandoned at the very celebration he thought he controlled. For once, Richard was the spectacle of pity. Some guests looked at him with disdain, others with a kind of cold satisfaction. No one rushed to comfort him. Daniel stepped forward, wrapping an arm around Isabella and Maria both. "This is our family," he said firmly, his voice carrying through the room. "This is the example of love and loyalty we will follow. Tonight is not about betrayal. It's about honor. It's about love that endures." Maria glanced up at him, her heart swelling with affection for the man her daughter had chosen. He was steady, respectful, everything Richard had failed to be. The way he included her in his declaration made her feel not like an afterthought, but an essential part of the new family they were building. The music swelled again as the band began to play, and slowly, the room shifted back into celebration. Guests danced, laughter returned, and joy blossomed anew. But this time, the joy was deeper, richer, as though everyone present understood they had witnessed not just a wedding, but a victory of love and dignity over cruelty. Maria found herself drawn to the dance floor by her daughter, who insisted on sharing a dance with her. The two of them moved slowly, holding hands, smiling through tears. Isabella leaned close and whispered, "I hope one day I can be half the woman you are, Mom." Maria shook her head gently, her voice breaking. "No, my love, you're already more. You showed courage I never could." They held each other, swaying to the music, the crowd watching them with warmth. Around them, the celebration pulsed with energy, but at its heart was this quiet moment between mother and daughter, a testament to resilience, to love unbroken by betrayal. In the corner, Richard remained seated, isolated, staring into his untouched drink. The room had moved on without him, his power dismantled by the very people he had once controlled. For the first time, he was invisible, and Maria no longer carried the weight of his shadow. The night belonged to her now. To her, to Isabella, to the family that chose love over cruelty. And as the music played, Maria lifted her head high, no longer the woman humiliated in silence, but the woman honored in the light.